Welcome back. In this lesson, we'll discuss solution number 1 for dealing with sibling rivalry and fighting. Back in session 4, we talked about the fact that behavior is goal-oriented and moves with an intended purpose, to get a payoff. So let's apply that to sibling fighting. When kids fight, what's the payoff? To determine the payoff for the fighting, we look at what happens as a result of the fighting. It's just another case of mistaken goals. When the kids fight and we end up getting involved, the payoff is attention, right? Think about it. You stop what you're doing to find out who started it and who did what to whom. In an instant, your kids have all of your attention and energy. And if you end up getting frustrated and yell, they get a hit of power. They were successful in pushing your buttons. Our involvement in kids' fights provides a big payoff. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but let's look at some of the problems that arise because of our involvement in our kids' fights. First, every time we get involved, we send the message that they can't figure things out on their own. We have no faith that they can resolve a conflict themselves without us, so why would they even try? In addition, when we do get involved, we always want to know who started it, who's at fault, and who needs to be punished. But when we do that, when we play judge and jury, we create and perpetuate victim and aggressor roles within our families. We don't intend to, of course, but that's exactly what happens. When we rescue the injured party, the victim, with poor babies and hugs and kisses, we give him a big payoff of attention. When we get mad and yell at the aggressor and send her to her room, she gets a payoff of confirming her power over her sibling and her parents. Over time, you'll see these roles pop up again and again as the victim does whatever it takes to provoke the sibling, because being the victim's a great way to get attention. And the so-called aggressor will continue to use power in negative ways over the sibling and maybe others. Dr. Rudolf Dreikurs, a pioneer in Adlerian education, said it best. When we side with the baby, protect one from the other, stand up for the seemingly abused one, we reinforce his feelings of inferiority and teach the victim how to use deficiency and weakness to gain special consideration, thus encouraging the very problem we're trying to eliminate. All of this means that there's an important mindset change that we have to make as parents. We have to get out of assigning victim and aggressor roles in our kids' fights. Kids are quick to blame each other, but they're not victims. Each child in the argument is participating, and each is getting a payoff. Remember that each child has a choice to simply walk away and leave the argument instead of ramping it up. We want to train our kids to skip the blame game and instead focus on solutions. For that to happen, we have to do our part. Instead of playing judge and jury, let's arm each of them with positive conflict resolution strategies that you'll learn in this session. These will help them stand up for themselves in a respectful way and work out their disagreements peacefully. And once you've laid the groundwork, eventually they'll do it without any help from you. The 4 solutions to address sibling rivalry are ignore now, train later, helpful adult intervention, and all in the same boat. When used as a progression, these strategies work like a charm for kids who are old enough to use reason and logic, usually by the late preschool years. Now, we'll talk more about how to manage conflicts between really young kids and their older siblings a bit later. But for now, we'll go over these 4 solutions for kids around age 4 all the way up to the late teens. So let's talk about the first one. Solution number 1 is to ignore the argument in the moment. What that means is that when you hear an argument brewing, you're going to tune it out. Stay out of the room or get up and leave without saying anything. Now, stay within earshot, of course, in case it gets out of hand, but at this point, pretend to be totally uninterested. Just like in the mistaken goals, we learn to ignore undue attention and withdraw from conflict in a power struggle. Same thing applies here because we don't want to give our kids a payoff for the fighting. Now, parents often have a really difficult time grasping this concept of ignoring the fight. They just don't believe they can do it. To have the strength to ignore the fight, we have to adjust our mindset about our role in sibling fighting. We have to remember that it's not our job to stop their fights or solve their disputes. They have to do it on their own. It's their fight and it's their problem. Remember, we won't be with them in school and we're not going to be with them as adults to resolve their conflicts. They have to do it on their own. We'll talk about our role in training them and how to do that a little bit later, but for right now, we're going to ignore the fight, stay out of it, and give them the chance to handle it on their own. Now, if you're feeling panicky, don't worry. There will be times that you do have to step in, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But for the vast majority of fights, the simple squabbles, you really can ignore them. The reason it's so important to resist getting involved is that it gives you time to assess whether your involvement is really necessary. More often than not, we really don't have to get involved. And the more you stay out of their fights, you'll find fewer and fewer times you really do have to get involved. If we step in and resolve every little dispute they have, it reinforces in their minds that they're not capable. They do need us to figure everything out. With solution number 1, we give them the time to resolve the problem on their own and let them try to work it out. And although you should appear to be completely ignoring the fight, you're actually going to be listening discreetly from a distance, right? That'll give you a chance to decide if your involvement is necessary, as well as what the key issues are and what training you may need to focus on down the road. Most of the time, though, you won't need to step in, especially as you're consistent in ignoring those fights. Now, before we start ignoring fights, we have to reveal in advance how we'll handle things in the future. Just like with revealing consequences, we'll have to have a discussion with the kids at a calm time and say something like, I've noticed that when you guys are fighting, very often I get involved and try to help you work it out. But you are really growing up, and I have faith that you guys can work out a lot of your own problems. So in the future, when you're having an argument or a conflict, I'm not going to get involved. I'm going to let you work it out. That takes strength, but that's the first step in resolving the sibling conflict. Now we've revealed in advance. In some of the fights, you will have to step in if things are getting out of hand, if somebody is getting hurt, or if the verbal sparring is getting out of bounds for your family norms. We'll talk about how to do that later. But for now, let's practice ignoring. Virtually all parents find that staying out of fights is so liberating. It's wonderful not needing to get involved in every little thing. What's more, within 2 or 3 days, most parents notice that the number and intensity of fights decreases since the payoff of attention has been removed. Now, solutions number 1 and 2 go hand in hand. You can't do solution number 1, ignore the fight, without training your kids in how to resolve fights on their own. So solution number 2 is called train later, and we'll cover that in the next lesson.